Healthcare workers have started going door to door in remote Aboriginal communities to boost low vaccine rates and protect vulnerable locals against the return of COVID.
A COVID vaccine on the front veranda.
Yes, Evan. Yeah.
Healthcare workers and community leaders in a walkabout vaccine clinic providing on-the-spot jabs to hesitant locals. Misinformation and complacency leaving Cherbourg with a first dose vaccine rate of 33.7%, the lowest in Queensland.
Well, I just didn't want to get it. Well, no one wants to get it, but you got to get it if you want to go places.
Free shirts and freedom. A message William Button is using to encourage his community to roll up their sleeves.
A lot of people, they were in the last lockdown and they didn't like it. And like I told them, this one is going to be harder.
What we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
They know the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one page, not hundreds of pages.
But what are the other 25 pages? I've read them. What are they?
What they are is a record of meetings. Some of them, they're records of the big lead-up that happened.
Do you agree with most of what is said in those 25 pages?
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it?
There's 120 pages. Why would I? I know what the conclusion is.
28 pedophiles on the Wood Royal Commission.
Sorry.
Are you doing a research into that? Is anybody investigating that? Anthony Albanese?
How about the Wood Royal Commission?
Yeah, the Wood Royal Commission.
How about the Wood Royal Commission?
We don't like having pedophiles running our country.
The people who stand with me on this stage I regard as giants.
Thomas Mayo.
Thomas Mayo written a handbook called the Voice to Parliament Handbook. All the detail you need.
Thomas Mayo is a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but was also entrusted with the physical document.
Mayo is part of the referendum working group.
He spent 18 months travelling around Australia to garner support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
And I tell you what, we are sick of governments not listening to our voice. We are going to use the rule book of the nation to force them.
There is nothing more powerful than building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with.
Keep going until we change the system, until we tear down the institutions that harm our people.
And also to pay respects to the elders of the Communist Party, who I think, without a doubt, have played a very important role in our activism.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
The power in the voice is that it creates the ability for First Nations to go forth with coherent positions on what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, and punish politicians that ignore our advice.
It should also be noted that according to the Independent Education Union of Australia, Thomas Mayo is only partially Aboriginal. His father is Filipino and his mother is Polish and Jewish, according to their archives. But he will have you believe Australian folk who have been here for generations are living on stolen land and should pay him rent. The Voice to Parliament is the new agenda for Australia, and the support behind this big push is anything but grassroots. In recent weeks, Australia has come to realise that everything from the banks, trade unions, corporations, and even so-called independent news media, as well as mainstream media, supports and promotes the Voice to Parliament. In fact, according to the Financial Review, almost all of the ASX top 20 companies publicly advocate for an Indigenous voice to Parliament ahead of this year's referendum. Today I wanted to focus on what is actually behind the voice, and the truth might shock you. The extent to which this voice to Parliament poses a threat to the future of our nation cannot be understated. I ask that all of you out there are made aware of just how deep it truly goes, so be sure to share this video around. Since Australians have to vote on this, I think it's important that we realise just how dangerous this bill is. Thomas Mayo has spoken publicly on many occasions and even written books about his master plan for Australia. He has outlined 3 main points in particular which are worthy of focus: voice, treaty, and truth. The slogan you can see being worn by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So we know where he stands. So the first point, voice. This is in reference to the Voice to Parliament, and putting it into the Constitution. Some of you might be asking, if this is just an advisory board, why does it need to be put into the Australian Constitution? Well, that's because once it's put into the Constitution, it can't be voted out. It's there to stay forever, and it can only be made stronger over time. They are laying the groundwork for more control in the future, which they openly admit to.
It's going to be very difficult once we succeed for a government to ignore this voice. It will be powerful when the people of Australia mandate that this First Nations voice must exist beyond the political cycles, because that's the goal here, is to set up a mechanism that actually exists despite the government of the day, and that's mandated by the people. So it is going to be this is why we've had the fight for years, because they know how powerful this will be, and that's why we're asking you to walk with us. We need the 97% to apply that political pressure.
The second point, treaty. What does this mean? Isn't this what the Communist Party and Antifa activists have written on all their posters at Black Lives Matter protests? Following the referendum, it's expected attention will shift towards the Maricata Commission to work on a national process of treaty making. In fact, mainstream media reports suggest the government might move even faster. Proponents of this treaty urge that it's about giving Aboriginal people self-determination. But upon closer inspection, what does that actually mean? It's actually about the 100-year-long, well-documented communist plan of giving sovereignty to Aboriginal people, giving them land and making them a separate entity to Australia. By doing this, they would basically be a law and a nation unto themselves, which will also allow them to bring anyone into the country that they choose, including enemies of Australia, militant revolutionists from overseas who have openly been preparing for such an event to happen? It creates a very large national security risk, especially when the CPA openly admits it's been trying to arm Aboriginals, form militias and create violent revolutions for around 100 years. A treaty would work one of two ways: the balkanisation of Australia, where territories and states become fragmented, or giving the Aboriginal people right to be an apartheid-wielding dictatorship over the entire nation, where democracy means nothing. Both of these plans are extensively written about in books and websites authored by communist and socialist activists in Australia, who openly admit to spearheading this entire agenda. On top of this security risk, it also poses a question about land and resource acquisition. Thomas Mayo has claimed publicly that he wants Australia to pay reparations and rent for living on the land. Meaning, all of you working class people who pay rent and mortgages on your home will be forced to pay additional rent for the privilege of living on this land.
At Voice architect Thomas Mayo for previously saying it will allow First Nations people to punish politicians for ignoring them.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
If you thought rental prices and inflation was bad now, you just wait. The third point that is outlined is truth, which is a reference to what they call truth-telling. They want propaganda programs and state-sanctioned brainwashing forced down the throats of Australian people about how evil white people are for being alive in this country. This weaponised indoctrination is aimed at education and media, but it also concerns the limit on freedom of speech. They want their own pseudo-history being told by Bruce Pascoe and people alike, and state-sponsored critical race theory being taught about so-called genocide of Aboriginal peoples. Yuri Bezmenov, a defector from the KGB, talks about this indoctrination process and how it's used by communists to overthrow nations.
According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages.
With all of this in mind, is it really all a coincidence that Thomas Mayo is openly pushing for what is very clearly a communist plan? No, not at all. He is a trained and fully pledged communist revolutionary. In an article written by Michael Smith, who did some fascinating research into the history of Thomas Mayo, he discovered certain information which comes of very little surprise. Thomas Mayo was the protege of Brian Manning, an MUA activist working on the Darwin Waves when a young Thomas Mayo put his hand up to be an organiser for the Maritime Union of Australia, Northern Territory branch. Quote, Brian Manning was an out-and-out communist, joining the CPA in Darwin in 1959. The following year, he was elected delegate to attend the Congress of the Communist Party of Australia. An ASIO document in 1962 reported in great detail the so-called penetration of Aboriginal organisations by communists, and detailed that in Darwin, communists, George Gibbs and Brian Manning, had helped establish the Northern Territory Aboriginal Rights Council in 1962. The focus of the struggle again shifted to independent activity of the Indigenous people themselves. And again, the Communist Party of Australia, CPA, left-wing trade unionists and socialist left offered vital support. The NTCAR, in which communist George Gibbs and Brian Mannings were leading members, played a crucial role. Gibbs was secretary of the NAWU, Militant Waterside Workers Section, whose executive had a CPA majority. Manning was a wharfie and a secretary of the CPA branch. The Darwin Waterside Workers had maintained their strong support for Aboriginal people's rights that began in the 1920s. Unquote. We have also uncovered articles both from MUA and Search Foundation, a successor to the Communist Party of Australia, where Thomas Mayo describes himself as a militant communist who seeks to overthrow the government. He has always worked closely with extremists, and he still does to this very day. Marcia Langton, for an example, a fully pledged, trained communist. According to the Unshackled and One Voice Australia, who both reported on this, for many years, Marcia was a high-ranking member of the National Committee of the Communist League, a Trotskyite group that campaigned for the violent overthrow of Australia and the implementation of a totalitarian regime. An organisation with links to espionage and terrorism. And this woman is meant to be one of the biggest figures behind the Voice to Parliament and the one who gets most of the media attention. She has also enjoyed the company of many politicians over the years, as well as trade unions, not to mention her long-standing relationship with ultra-rich Jewish businessman Mark Liebler, who's been involved in Aboriginal committees for decades.
The racist thing, undesirables, pedophiles, Nazi filth into cookers, so an extreme right-winger.
White and racist.
Spewing the racism.
White racism.
Lunatic fascists.
Eugenicism.
Are specious and increasingly absurd.
Racism and stupidity.
Fascist.
Racism.
The nefarious, Trump-like, anti-Semitic filth, racist nonsense.
Racism expressed.
This racist extremism, idiotic Ku Klux Klan.
Racist and stupid.
Racist nonsense.
The police are racist. Most Australians are racist.
To base racism on post-Trumpian right-wing extremism, the whole of Australia needs to be re-educated.
And I'm certainly not a racist.
White boy, no. That evil Marcia Langton. Just sheer stupidity.
Mr Dodson delivered Saturday's keynote speech at the 2023 Chiefly Conference in Canberra. The conference is held annually before Parliament's first sitting week of the year to help set the upcoming political agenda. Mr Dodson says passing the Uluru Statement of the Heart will be a key focus for the government.
It's time for us to shift this axis of the relationship we've had to date. It's time for us to do that. Why shouldn't the First Nations people secure a formal structure through which it can provide advice to the Parliament and the government on matters which affect them? If we do pass this referendum, we'll be a better country. There'll be no doubt about that.
Mark Liebler himself is also another big proponent behind The Voice, with a very extensive history in lobbying political candidates and enjoying the ear of politicians for decades. His role in Aboriginal advocacy spans all the way back to the 1980s and perhaps even earlier.
Perhaps the most curious comes from Australia, from a private investigator named Jeffrey Hossick. Now, Hossick caused the US State Department office in Melbourne, Australia, a woman named Sandra Stevens, who's a consulate official there, to send a letter to the State Department, which was forwarded to ATF. And what the letter said is, quote, Howell, that is David Koresh, was heading in one of the following directions: a final Jonestown massacre, an armed confrontation with authorities, or some bizarre behavior, such as an attempted assassination of a public figure, end quote. Now, how does an individual private eye in Australia end up getting the State Department to intervene with ATF to push ATF to launch this investigation and attack? Well, Hossick is not just a private eye. He works very closely with the law firm in Australia of Arnold Bloch Liebler. And the Liebler family in Australia is a family which has been exposed in the press there as a Mossad operation, that is Israeli intelligence, and that they work with the Jewish Center in Melbourne, which is an affiliate of the Cult Awareness Network and an affiliate of the Anti-Defamation League, the same network that Jeff was describing. And so from that, it's not just one private eye who's meeting with several former members, but it's an official of this operation who was reporting to the State Department, which then asked that the ATF do something.
In fact, almost everybody of relevance behind this voice has got some history connecting them directly to the CPA. From Noel Pearson, for an example, who works on the committees of many Aboriginal groups which are openly spearheaded by communist revolutionaries. Lara Watson, the Indigenous officer at the ACTU trade union, which according to its history on Wikipedia was started by communists with direct links to former Soviet Russia. She's also been photographed attending and sometimes even guest speaking at many of the protests and events run by CPA affiliate organisations and activist groups. Even the Prime Minister himself, Anthony Albanese, is yet another trained communist, who has his roots in trade unions and the CPA itself, where he has given interviews and been photographed at their events and activities in the past. Linda Burney, handpicked by Anthony Albanese and the current Minister for Indigenous Australians, a very questionable past, and also very quick to call any and all opposition to The Voice a hateful racist, which as it stands is now more than half of the country. I could go on and on and on about the communist puppets behind this bill, but for the sake of time, I have to move on. One thing that should be made known to the Australian public is that this voice to Parliament is nothing new. Neither is the call for a treaty or Aboriginal sovereignty and land rights. All of this originated back in the 1920s by the CPA and other radical revolutionaries who saw Aboriginal advocacy, immigration, and workers' rights as pillars that could be used to eventually overthrow countries with Indigenous populations, like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Following the success the Bolsheviks had with their 1917 revolution in Russia, many documents were being written by communist and Marxist leaders utilising the issue of native land rights as a way of fomenting militant revolution in these countries. Ever since then, communists have been behind the creation of most of the Aboriginal committees we see today. Bruce C. Ruxton was a highly decorated World War II veteran, former president of the Victorian RSL, and an all-round Australian hero who has long since been forgotten by the general public. During his life as a public figure, he started to express political concerns about the direction Australia was headed in. In the preface of MacDonald's book, Red Over Black, he claims the following, quote, Australia's future as a free Western nation was seriously threatened by two movements. One, to use the Aboriginal land rights issue to eventually establish a separate Aboriginal nation under communist domination, and second, to fragment a homogenous and stable Australia by a breaking down of a traditional immigration policy, and by the deliberate fostering of a multiculturalism which could only end with the balkanisation of Australia, unquote. Bruce Ruxton was no conspiracy theorist. He was a military insider who loved his country. In fact, he was merited with many honours in his life. Bruce claimed that there was a growing communist influence in Australia, showing how the old-time concept of communist revolutionaries using force to seize control of the state and its institutions during a crisis had been supplanted by a movement of insidious infiltration, which has penetrated deep into the media, the education system, the government bureaucracy, and the most disturbing of all, into many Christian churches. A former Australian communist insider turned whistleblower, Jeff McDonald, in his own words, learned about communist strategy and tactics through a lifetime in the labour and trade union movement and intensified by the years he spent inside the Communist Party. Jeff wrote a series of books and gave a series of lectures warning the Australian public to the extent that Australia was becoming infiltrated by communism. Jeff McDonald details how fake Aboriginal organisations, financed with money through foreign embassies and agents, were set up by communists for the purpose of using issues like land rights to gain legal authority over territory and institutions, which would ultimately allow communists in through the back door. Through the balkanisation of Australia and media propaganda being used as psychological warfare against the Australian public, it would become possible to weaken Australia militarily and put its resources, territory, and tax dollars into the hands of communists and nations like China through its proxy Aboriginal rights. One example of this, found in his book Red Over Black, was the World Council of Indigenous Affairs, which often spoke at the United Nations. Quote, the Canberra 1981 conference was its third General Assembly, at which it agreed in principle to develop an international law on Indigenous rights. It calls for the rights of Indigenous people to associate their territory and institutions with one or more states in a manner involving free association. regional autonomy, home rule, or associate statehood as self-governing units. It was highly significant that the World Council of Indigenous Peoples Conference should be held in Australia at a time when the Aboriginal land rights campaign was being greatly intensified. The conference provided support for the campaign launch in April 1979, when the Second National Conference of the National Aboriginal Conference passed a resolution demanding a treaty between Aboriginals and the Commonwealth Government. Immediately following this, as if awaiting a signal, the Aboriginal Treaty Committee emerged, chaired by DHC Coombs, and proclaimed intention of mobilising public opinion amongst whites. Not one single member of Coombs' committee is an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander. Unquote. Next time you see Antifa and communist-led Aboriginal organisations marching through the streets of Brisbane, Canberra and Melbourne, protesting for a treaty or the lawful transfer of land and resources, know that at its core, it was always a communist tactic and not an Aboriginal one. In fact, another tactic Jeff McDonald discusses in his book, Red Over Black, is how bought and paid for politicians, members of the press and activists are highly trained Marxists, and regardless of whether they are Aboriginal or not, they don't actually care about Aboriginals or their rights as human beings. They are working for the political expediency of a communist takeover of Australia. They intend to do this by weakening industrial development, promoting destructive levels of immigration, gaining a stronghold in education, and ultimately the transfer of our nation into the hands of radical activists.
Every day in the newspapers, we are reading news about the land rights movement allegedly being pursued on behalf of Aborigines. We have even read in the newspapers several times since last November of how people claiming to represent the Aboriginal nation have been to the United Nations Human Rights Commission seeking the support of that outside body to take Australia to the International Court of Justice in order to question our right to the sovereignty of Australia, to in fact declare that the Aborigines are entitled to self-determination, which in the terms of international law means their right to secede. And it also would mean that the Aboriginal people in fact had sovereignty all over Australia. In the United Nations, evidence has been piled up against our country from all sorts of people, including such as Al Grasby, people like Charlie Perkins, alleging that the Australian people are racist, which they are not. They are among the most tolerant, if not the most tolerant people in the world. Parliament is divided over debates on the issue. Now, the point about all this is that the background to it, the reasons for this movement, which is neither in the interests of the Aborigines or the white people, is something that people discuss every day. And in particular, those people who have either a responsibility for the defence of the country or the average citizen who is now becoming deeply agitated about what all this is about. And they come to debate this issue and to explore its significance from various backgrounds. I can only tell you of my own background and my own concern about it, and that is because I grew up as a member of the Communist Party, in the sense that my father was a member, and as a child I believed in those views, and as soon as I was old enough, which is 18, I became a member myself. And I remained a member for 13 years. We were taught about the theory of the national and the colonial question. It had been developed by Joseph Stalin under the instructions of Lenin. Now, put simply, that theory was that the best way to achieve power in any country that had indigenous peoples, such as in Australia with our Aborigines, was to start what you would call an anti-colonial movement for the indigenous peoples to regain their land. Linked with that were issues of promoting so-called multiculturalism and multiracialism, which would break the homogeneity of the nation, which then allowed the communists to take power. Now, with regard to the Aborigines, I never, as I said, took this very seriously, and it wasn't until several years after I was expelled from the party, that was in 1960, that I started to read in the newspapers about the developing land rights movement, claims being made by Aborigines, sympathetic newspaper editorials, and so on. And I started to think to myself, good heavens, this is the theory that we were taught about in the Communist Party. And of course another nudge to make a person with my background wake up to what was happening is that some of the people you would see speaking allegedly on behalf of the Aborigines on the television would be people that you'd grown up with in the Communist Party. And as I said, I've been in the trade union movement all my life, and when you work at the Trades Hall, you're never away from communist propaganda and literature, and in any case, being a former communist, you still read their material to study the course and direction of their activities. And it became very clear to me how communists were manipulating this movement. Now, in order to try and get this message across to the Australian public as to what was taking place and what were the objectives of the communist movement, I wrote a book called Red Over Black. And in it what I've done is to mainly quote material that was readily available to the average citizen, that he could check through newspaper files, through local libraries. I quoted only a few communist textbooks, but as well as that, dealing with my own experience. Since then, because of the number of questions I've received, and I quite understand that people would wonder and be incredulous about how clever and how highly involved the communist movement is in our society and how it has been directing this land rights movement. So that I have produced another book, a smaller book, called The Evidence. Now in that, I've gone through the communist archives that are in the Mitchell Library in Sydney and in other libraries, but I mention the Mitchell Library particularly because you can find almost everything there, in which they have got all of the newspapers, journals, textbooks and other theoretical material from the communist movement since 1920. And I've shown in this little book how the communists themselves, in order to explain to their own members what they had to do, explained how the ultimate objective is the establishment of a new, separate, independent nation of Aborigines. And they say it in those very words, that so-called Aboriginal nation is to be recognised by countries outside Australia, that they are to have their own army. Now, we all appreciate the fact that the Aborigines neither have the numerical strength, supposing they even wanted this sort of thing, to establish an army. But the idea of an army on land rights areas is to bring in uninvited Asian and other so-called refugees or migrants. Again, that is very well documented from their own sources. Now, as I said, we are discussing a question of Australia's defence and its security, the importance of which cannot be underestimated and concerns the interests of every Australian, their children and the children in the future. It also concerns the welfare of the Aborigines who are being manipulated by these white communist activists. Now, one of the reasons they have been able to get away with this for so long is that they've got a trigger word, McCarthyism. Even though, as you will be able to see when you read the evidence, all Red Over Black, by checking what I've said in that book, I appeal to people to check the accuracy or otherwise of what I'm saying, and that's why the original sources are quoted. But you will see there how they explain very clearly how they've been organising Aborigines into the communist movement, how they've been developing programs on behalf of Aborigines, and the point is that you will find the names of people there mentioned. People like Don McLeod, who've been working among the Aborigines there for many, many years. I remember once when I was first in the Communist Party, they were calling for volunteers to go and work among the Aborigines. Again, I never took that at all seriously, being a union official. But in using that trigger word racism, they try and push people into a position of moral cowardice or fear, such as they do by using the trigger word racism, as a cover to their activities. Probably the classic example of this that we've seen in Australia has been in the case of the Queensland Premier Joe Bulgicki-Peterson, who's one politician who has spoke out openly on this issue. He's shown an understanding of what it is all about and has spoken in the defence of Australia. Now, you see these, particularly in the southern states, cartoons of Joe Bulgicki-Peterson looking like Frankenstein. The Queensland people are supposed to be part of the deep north, something like an alleged Ku Klux Klan area in the southern part of the United States, none of which reflects accuracy. Fortunately, people are now beginning to wake up to this. And one of the methods that the communists have been using to try and stop me and other people from speaking out about these issues is to use the smear technique, this McCarthyism, racist, etc. And it should be on a moment's reflection. When you hear this word racism, you should remember that they are also talking about you. They'll say some organisation or politician or individual is a racist to try and get the rest of Australians not to listen to their views. And at the same time, they are supporting this application before the United Nations to try and say that the Australian people as a whole are racists, and it is a weapon being used against us. I therefore put it to you strongly that, as a defence matter, Australians have all got to consider how these trigger words McCarthyism and racism are used to stop them from thinking about the real issues. But because the United Nations is being geared up as an instrument to recognise the land rights areas as an independent nation and to impose sanctions, which is now being openly discussed against Australia like they did in Rhodesia, then it is incumbent upon all Australians to have at least some knowledge of the international legal arguments being used against us and how they should be countered. Now, I said earlier that the argument about the Aborigines having sovereignty over Australia involves questions of international law. We have before Parliament at the present time a resolution being put by the Labor government in which they state that they are prepared to recognise that Australia was taken by conquest. That means that this government is saying they are prepared to state that the British government invaded Australia and took it from the Aborigines. Now, nobody is denying that the Aborigines lived in Australia prior to the coming of the white man. But if in terms of international law, and I ask you to consider that we are only talking about the meaning of words in international law, if we say that the Aborigines owned and occupied Australia, it means that they had an organised, civilised society such as we would equate with a nation-state or a group of nations. In Victoria, the government there introduced a bill in which the first thing they said was that we recognise the prior ownership and occupation of Australia by the Aborigines. Now, that's the type of evidence that is being used against Australia in the United Nations to say that we live here illegally. And it is the basis of the new campaign being run by the Marxists involved in manipulating the land rights movement, is that they are saying that we now have to pay the rent for the right to live here outside of the land rights areas. I have another book coming out on international law which gives the detail from their original sources, which you would be able to read to check on what I'm saying. Unfortunately, the issue is not being debated into clarity in our parliament any more than the real issues behind Asian and the new wave of Negro migration being introduced to Australia by the government is being discussed. One of the main publications being used to break Australia's security is a journal called Australian Quarterly. It's got out by the Australian Institute of Political Science, so-called. You can obtain this from 32 Market Street, Sydney, or you can get it from your library. And if your library hasn't got it, then get them to order it from the main public library in your capital city. The autumn 1983 issue has the most up-to-date plans of attack against Australia. Now, if you were a military person, you could never imagine anything better than to have the enemy's plans put in front of you. But in politics, we sometimes don't recognise what these plans are. So I recommend to you for study an article by Professor Colin Tatz of the Macquarie University in New South Wales. He is a lecturer in political science, and he has there an article headed Aborigines and the Age of Atonement. It is the most incredible diatribe I have ever read of hatred against the Australian people. It accuses Australians of racism, but most particularly it deals from someone on the other side as to how these legal arguments being used against us by claimants to represent the Aboriginal nation, both inside Australia and in United Nations organisations, he explains what they are about. He points out that in September 1975, that Mr Neville Bonner got up in the House, that is in the Senate, and moved a resolution that the Australian government recognises prior ownership and occupation of Australia by the Aborigines, and that they should have reparations, etc. This has got nothing to do with giving a fair deal to the Aborigines. Now, I mentioned to you that I have produced a book called The Evidence. Now, in that, among other things, I have shown how the communist movement, including the declarations from Moscow, which were adopted by the Communist Party in Australia, how you had to be very careful, and I was taught this in the Communist Party, we were all atheists. We were taught that in our criticisms of the churches, we had to go very careful, because we didn't want to what they called sectarianism. We didn't want to be sectarian and isolate ourselves. But one group they never let up on in their hatred, and that was the missionaries and the missions among the Aborigines. And it's obvious when you tour the settlements and you hear all of the evidence that I did, and I'll tell you this, I not only went to settlement after settlement, but I spoke to a whole convention of Aborigines, or rather moved around talking to them for 7 days. That was at Port Augusta in last January. The missionary said I had to go there in order to finalise my studies. And the thing is that communism has got no hope at all among the Australian Aborigines while Christianity is there. And apart from sheer irresponsibility and lack of even human feeling towards the welfare of Aborigines, and of course it's the same thing with whites. I mean, we know that our civilisation is based on Christianity. It is really a question of getting the Aborigines back to what Christians might call a pagan or Stone Age belief, because communism cannot coexist with Christianity. I'd only repeat what seems to me to be quite miraculous, and I have no explanation of the effect that Christianity has on them, but the Aborigines do. I appeal to you, those of you particularly in churches, that you should get missionaries, say from the United Missionaries Association of Western Australia, to come and address you, to get full-blood Aborigines to come and speak to you, to get their voice heard. One of the points I've made in Red Over Black is that if you wanted to hear the voice of the true Aborigine in Queensland, that you had to read newspapers like Queensland Country Life, because the papers where Aborigines told them what they really thought. The journalists in the major newspapers weren't even interested in talking to them. It comes as a surprise to most people to know that the Queensland Aborigines voted overwhelmingly to support the type of land tenure legislation that the Queensland government has. And I note that in the trade union movement, we are used to organising disputes. It's one of our jobs. We know how to organise demonstrations, etc. And by that means of deductive observation, we could ourselves, the Melbourne Trades Hall, when the build-up to the boycott of the Brisbane Games was on, we could see there the biggest promotion ever made in Australian history to put on a dispute. They had the support of the major television stations and the newspapers. Charlie Perkins was talking about bloodshed in the streets. Hell was going to play. They were going to have thousands of Aborigines. Now, if there was any way possible to get those thousands of Aborigines to demonstrating at Brisbane, then they had all the backup to do it. and all they could get was a relative handful of Aborigines at the front, hardly any of them full-blood Aborigines, although I've got nothing against urban Aborigines. Nobody has. They'd be stupid if they did. They're all our brothers and sisters. But the point is, what was demonstrated with these hundreds of whites behind a handful of Aborigines, that this land rights movement had no support among the Aborigines. While Don and Meg Chedley and I were going through the Kimberley, and we spent 9 days and 9 nights going around in a Toyota truck, we never came across any settlement that was supporting this land rights campaign, one reason being that they've already got land rights, which all Aborigines have got in Australia who require them. But at the same time, there was a campaign being run by an organisation calling itself the Kimberley Land Council. And they were claiming sovereignty over the whole of the Kimberley, claiming that they represented the Aborigines, which they did not. They get plenty of government finance to do this. The revolutionary movement among Aborigines is paid by you, the taxpayer. They get jobs and representing health organisations, so-called, etc., people who couldn't put a bandage on, running around well paid and well assisted by cars, etc., promoting a land rights movement which is alien both to the Aborigines themselves as individuals who want to live together with Australians, and manipulated by a quite alien force that is out to destroy the whole of Australia, which, as anyone would know, would cause the same problems they've got in Britain. We've even been warned by Negroes about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I repeat to you that what we are discussing is a defence matter. It is up to you to give consideration to it. It's up to you to act on it. And in relation to this, as I said, when we talked about the national and the colonial question, it also dealt with so-called multiculturalism and multiracialism. Now, it's quite absurd for anyone to have anything at all to get against another race of people. It doesn't matter who they are part of one great family of races throughout the planet. But it just so happens that in too large a numbers, they do not live together in a very united way. They have different prides and cultures and so on.
We do have to bring you our vote, because you have been voting in the text and online vote today. So here is the result. Is multiculturalism working? Here is what you told us. 5% of those of you who voted said yes, it is. 95% of those of you who voted this morning said no, it isn't.
And I didn't even know that the migration program from Black Africa had commenced to Australia. In Red Over Black, I explained how we'd been taught about these things in the Communist Party, and I quoted from a more recent Marxist textbook saying that we had to have Negro migration to Australia from Haiti and from Black Africa.
And the phenomenon in Western civilization is massive amounts of immigration. You can't debate it. You can't even talk about it, or you're a Nazi. We've all heard the words before. So we have forced immigration, forced integration, forced assimilation, and then they tell us to go about our inevitable brown future. They're doing this in white countries and only white countries. You know, China's still going to be Chinese 50 years from now. Africa's still going to be Africa. Saudi Arabia is still going to be full of Arabs, but we're all supposed to be blended.
But these Aborigines were the ones who told me about it. They were very emotionally upset. And I can understand it, because they're justifiably proud of the fact that they are Australia's black people. And they know that the government is always talking about jobs for Aborigines, which they don't give them. That they bring Asian migrants to have jobs in the post office, and they won't give them to young Aborigines, etc. But they believe that the Negro migration program, which at that time, a few weeks ago, was 140 the first batch, with a promise of many more to come, they believe that's going to make the Australian Aboriginal second fiddle to the Negro. Now, nobody consults with them about it. And what I'm putting to you is that the architects behind this know exactly what they're doing. They know that it causes antagonism among the Aborigines. They know and expect that Australia is going to have the multiracial problems of Britain, and they even hope it will get as bad as what it is in the United States.
Jeff McDonald also further explained some of the psychological warfare tactics communists use to further their own agenda. You'll often see these communist tactics being used by the corporate left-wing media, terms attributed to anyone in opposition to the communist plan of taking over Australia. Terms like racist, colonialist, etc. These words are weaponised in order to discredit political opponents on the basis of some subjective moral principle. Like, for an example, "Oh, you don't believe the Aboriginals have a right to self-determination? You must be a racist." Or, "Anyone who celebrates Australia Day must be a colonialist who supports the genocide of Aboriginals." The tactic employed here is to disarm your opinions by discrediting you as some type of unreasonable bigot, when in actuality, the communists don't care about Aboriginals. In fact, when communism does take place, these are usually the very first people to be pushed into the gulags. The point of this exercise of weaponising words is to further their own political ambitions of Marxism and communism. The people they claim to represent are just political pawns and a means to an end. Nowhere in the world where communism has been implemented has it worked. It's always had devastating results and is directly responsible for the biggest genocides in human history. With enough communists and media personalities using these tactics of psychological warfare, it doesn't take very long before everyday people, who aren't necessarily communists, also start regurgitating these very same words. Like this woman, for an example.
This is Ground Zero, genocide. Ground Zero happened here on 26th of January, 1788. Nobody should be celebrating.
She probably means very well. But does she actually know what she's advocating for? Does she actually know who's behind these causes? Probably not. This is what you call cultural warfare. They can take something that is seen as fringe, wrong, and incorrect, within the space of a generation, make it seem normal, necessary, and pleasant. This type of cultural warfare is often referred to as postmodernism, cultural Marxism, or ideological subversion. This is exactly the slippery slope of ever-changing moral virtues depicted in George Orwell's book, 1984. If you've made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you share it around with your friends. Thanks for watching. Until next time.